Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today, I want to talk about the troubles that young men face from about the time they are teenagers, let's say around about 15 years old, way into their manhood. These troubles originate with the evolutionary foundations of our species. Historically, and for a few millennia, men were required to hunt. They were required to fight. And they were required to protect their families, their homes, and later on, their tribes and their countries. Increasingly, men are no longer seen as hunters. They are no longer seen as protectors. And the roles that resonate with them deeply within their psyche has become all but redundant. And this has led to a crisis, a deep crisis within man and his masculinity. It is a crisis of alarming proportion. It is a crisis that has resulted in men becoming dropouts, in men committing suicide, in men going their own way, in men opting not to mate, men opting to become celibates, and men wanting to be left alone. How did we get here, you may ask? That is what I want to document for you today. Because in understanding the problem, or in better understanding the problem, we are able to arrive at a viable and sustainable solution, insha'Allah. Historically, societies often functioned along gender lines. Men had certain roles to play, and women had certain roles to play. However, it was viewed in more recent times that these gendered roles led to the oppression of women, that women did not possess the choice to undertake or participate in roles that were different to what these gendered roles dictated. Namely, because women were predominantly homemakers and men were predominantly breadwinners, as is still often the case in most of the world, other than the first world, we find that it was not always possible, nay, it was not in fact impossible, but rather it was not always easy for women to be properly integrated into roles that were once reserved for men. And so, in this attempt to integrate women into those roles, the playing field had to change. And at this point, we are not making a judgment. We are not saying that one is better than the other. We are just trying to more or less gauge how we arrived at where we are today. With the onset of technological advancements, and a few to mention specifically, the playing field was indeed changed, and things became more equal in that women were now also able to, and are able to, occupy similar jobs to what men have historically occupied, although not entirely so. And I will get to that later. What we find in historical society pre industrial revolution is that a lot of the jobs that existed were in fact of a manual nature. They were physical in nature. They required physical strength. It was burdensome and it was dangerous. It was jobs that we would otherwise say, or they would say, it was not suitable for women. I know that some people hate that statement, but that was how it was. And so, according to the common conventions of the time, since it was more suitable for men to undertake these roles that required greater physical strength, because it is merely a biological reality that men possess greater physical strength, women played the other role, the other very important role, and that was to nurture children. It was to be homemakers, to look after. Incidentally, women still have much of that within themselves. It is instinctive, it is innate within many women to want to nurture, to want to look after, to want to have children. However, post-industrial revolution, a world that was now more reliant on technological advancement, a world that had electricity, a world that had gadgets, a world that required the type of work that were more akin to soft skills, could see women in the workplace. Women in the workplace, however, didn't come about just because there were jobs available that women could do. It was not that simple. On the back of the Industrial Revolution, societies still largely functioned in a very traditional way. However, post World War I, and when the United States went through its Great Depression in the 1920s, women needed to work. It was not merely a right being fought for, as many feminists want us to believe, but it was through economic necessity. Men had suffered a lot, had died, and the economy needed to keep functioning with men at war. And so the solution was to get women to work. Someone needed to work in these factories. So for the economic advancement, out of necessity, of the United States, women went to work. And when women went to work, something changed dramatically in the society. And that was men no longer had autonomy. Men no longer had the autonomy they used to have because women were no longer financially dependent on men or as financially dependent on men as they once were. Hence, men needed to change some of their strategies in order to manage their homes. That we will get to at a later time. Now, with women in the workplace, it meant that men who started coming back from the war were not able to get jobs. There were only so many jobs, and only so many people could be employed. In order to sustain a growing workforce, with there being too few jobs available and a surplus of labor, according to the laws of supply and demand, the price of labor went down. Hence, whereas prior to that situation, men were the sole breadwinners, in the new situation, both men and women worked. And men could no longer afford to be the sole breadwinners because they were now earning less than they would have originally earned, simply because there was now a surplus of labor. And companies could afford to pay much less than they would ordinarily have paid when there was a shortage of labor, because half the population didn't work, the female half of the population. What happened, though, incidentally, was that while women felt it was a great victory for them because now they got this right, the right to work, they won. They still wanted and demanded from men what they always demanded from men, and that is that a good man is he who can take care of his woman, financially, that is, and in other ways, if you know what I mean. However, the economy having adjusted, men were less and less able to do so because now they were sharing the jobs. And this resulted in a downward spiral. Eventually, it got to where we are now, and that is the short of it. So what we find is this innate instinct of men to want to be the breadwinners, to want to look after, to want to protect, is now seen as being toxic. How dare you want to own us? How dare you want to protect us? We don't need protection. We don't need men to look after us because we can do it ourselves. And so, in as far as men validate who they are in relation to what they can do for their woman and for children, it has become a bit of a bust for them. They are no longer able to define themselves in that way. And that has led to a disaster. Because if a man is not able to define himself in terms of what he can do for his family, then how does he define himself? It's a real question. It's not rhetorical. Because this is how males, have defined themselves for millennia. And this is not only how men have defined themselves, but how women have defined men. And so you see, men are not human beings. Men are human doings. And if men cannot do, then they cannot be. And that is the reality for men. And that has been the reality for men for thousands of years. And in this time, men are not even human doings. And so what are they? And therein lies the problem.